Welcome to another deep dive, you guys. Today we're going to be taking a look at The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell. You know, that book that kind of dives into how, small things can make a huge difference. We're going to be talking about how trends go viral, how ideas spread like crazy, and all those kind of mysterious forces that make some things just, skyrocket and others just fall flat.
Yeah. Yeah, it's super interesting. Gladwell uses the analogy of epidemics to explain this point.
Oh, okay.
So think about it, right? A single sneeze can start this chain reaction that impacts a whole community. And similarly, these seemingly tiny things can have this massive role in making a product or an idea a success or a flop, even social movements, which is kind of crazy to think about.
Okay, so we've got all these social epidemics happening all around us, but where does it even begin? Where do they start?
Well, so Gladwell talks about this thing he calls the law of the few. And it's basically the idea that it all comes down to certain types of people.
Okay.
And he calls them connectors, mavens, and salesmen. And they're totally key to spreading information and kicking off these trends we're talking about.
All right, let's break it down. First up, the connectors. Gladwell mentions this guy, Roger Horchow, and it sounds like this guy knows everyone, literally like a walking social network.
Well,
what makes these connectors so special?
I think the best way to think about them is bridges between different worlds.
Okay.
They just naturally connect with people from all walks of life and spread information super easily as they go. It's not just they're social butterflies. They're kind of weaving this fabric of society one connection at a time.
Wow, it's making me rethink my own friend groups and stuff.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so next we've got these mavens. I feel like we all know someone like this. They're kind of obsessed with knowing everything about everything, and then just can't wait to tell you all about it.
Right. And Gladwell actually uses this professor, Mark Alpert, as the ultimate maven. This guy literally spent months researching TVs before he finally bought one. And then he went and documented the whole thing and shared his findings with anyone who'd listen, which is pretty funny to me.
Wow, that's dedication. But it's not just about hoarding information with these mavens. It seems like there's something else that motivates them.
Yeah, totally. It's this drive to help other people, navigate all the craziness of life. They really want to empower people with information, whether it's scoring the best deal on that new TV or just understanding a complex topic.
So they're kind of like the ultimate go-to person, always there to lend a hand or offer some amazing insight. And then lastly, we have the salesmen, the masters of persuasion. Are these people just born with that gift of gab, or is there something else going on?
Well, Gladwell highlights this guy, Tom Gow, who's a financial planner with almost superhuman charisma. He scored almost perfectly on a charisma test.
Yeah.
But it's not just charm, though.
Yeah.
It's also about the power to connect with people on a deeper level, to inspire action and build trust. Think about a time when someone convinced you to, try something new. They probably had that salesman smark, that ability to get you excited about something.
That's making me wonder if I have any secret salesman skills hiding in me somewhere. But this is where things get super interesting. Gladwell links this whole law of the few to Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, the British are coming thing.
Right.
The history class.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a perfect example of how the right messenger can completely change how a message is received. Paul Revere wasn't the only writer that night, but his network of connections and how strategic he was made his ride way more impactful than this other guy, William Dawes, who set out with the exact same message.
Oh, wow. So it's not just what you say, it's who says it and who they're saying it to.
Yeah.
Makes you think, okay, so we've got these amazing people spreading the word, but what about the message itself? How do you make an idea stick? So people actually remember it and want to do something about it?
Yeah. Well, that's where the stickiness factor comes in.
Oh.
Gladwell really dives into how to create a message that truly resonates, something that actually makes an impact and doesn't just go in one ear and out the other.
And he uses Sesame Street as an example, which I find really interesting because you wouldn't necessarily think that a show like that needs a ton of research and planning. Isn't it just singing puppets and colorful letters?
Well, it might look simple on the surface, but the people who made Sesame Street were super meticulous. They actually did a ton of research and testing to make sure the show really grabbed kids' attention and, most importantly, that the educational part actually stuck with them. They even did this thing called a distractor study to see just how engaged kids were with different parts of the show.
Okay, now I have to know, what's a distractor study? Were they like bringing in clowns and juggling pins to try and distract the kids?
Pretty much. They'd show two things at the same time, one being the Sesame Street pit and the other being something like way more visually stimulating to distract them. That way they could see what the kids were actually paying attention to and make changes based on that, which I think is super smart.
Yeah, very interesting. So they were basically always tweaking and improving the show based on like solid data. That's pretty impressive for a kid's show. And Gladwell compares Sesame Street to Blue's Clues, which seems to take this whole stickiness idea to a whole new level.
Yeah, Blue's Clues is really interesting. It's all about going slow, repeating things, and telling stories in layers. It's very intentional. This approach helps kids process the information, make connections, and really get involved in the story.
So it's not just about keeping kids glued to the screen, but about creating this immersive experience where they're actually learning and engaged. This whole stickiness concept. It's not just for kids shows, though, right? Gladwell uses a pretty cool example from the world of marketing.
Oh, yeah. He talks about this guy, Lester Wonderman, who was like a marketing genius. He had this job to make print ads for the Columbia Record Club stand out. And his solution was surprisingly simple.
Okay, what did he do?
He added a gold box.
A gold box. That's it?
Yep. And it's the perfect example of how even a tiny detail can totally change things. The gold box worked as like a visual cue. It grabbed people's attention and instantly made the ad more memorable. It didn't change the actual message, but it made it stick.
It's making me think about all those little things that catch my eye when I'm out and about. Those subtle things that probably influence my decisions without me even realizing it. Pretty sneaky. Okay, so we've got the law of the few and the stickiness factor. What's the third thing Gladwell talks about?
The third element is what he calls the power of context. It's the idea that our surroundings and social cues have a huge influence on us, often way more than we realize.
So sometimes it's not about who we are, but about where we are and who we're with. Like, our environment really shapes us.
Exactly. And Gladwell has some pretty interesting examples. He starts with Bernie Goetz and the NYC subway system back in the 80s. Picture, like, New York in the middle of a crazy crime wave. Subways are covered in graffiti. There's this feeling that no one's in control.
And then Bernie Goetz kind of becomes this, like, symbol of the whole mess when he shoots those four guys on a subway car. That was such a controversial case, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. What Goetz did was extreme, but it reflected how scared and frustrated a lot of New Yorkers were at the time. But what's super interesting is how the city eventually got a handle on the crime. And it wasn't by hiring thousands of new cops or anything like that.
So what did they do? What was their secret weapon?
It's called the broken windows theory. Basically, it says that visible signs of crime, like graffiti and people dodging fares, actually encourage more serious crime.
Oh, wow.
It's like sending this message that nobody cares and rules don't matter.
So by cracking down on those smaller things, they actually shifted the whole feel of the city.
Exactly. It might sound counterintuitive, but fixing those broken windows sent a really strong message. Think about your own life, right? Have you ever noticed how a small change in your environment, like cleaning up your desk, can make you more productive or just change your mood? That's the power of context at work.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
It's making me think about all these little things around me that I don't even notice, but that are probably influencing me in ways I'm totally clueless about.
Right. And Gladwell takes this idea of how context shapes us even further with something called the fundamental attribution error, which is basically our tendency to overestimate personality and underestimate the situation when we're judging other people's behavior.
So, like, we assume someone's a jerk just because they cut us off in traffic without thinking about maybe they're rushing to the hospital or something.
Exactly. We're so quick to judge someone's character without considering what might be going on in their life. Gladwell uses these clever experiments to show this. Imagine two groups of basketball players. One shooting hoops in a well-lit gym, the other in a dimly lit one. Obviously, the players in the well-lit gym did better.
Right, that makes sense. But I bet people watching thought they were just better players overall, even though it's just the lighting messing things up.
You got it. There's another experiment with a quiz game where people were randomly assigned as either the contestant or the questioner. The questioners got to pick the questions, obviously, and they chose topics they were experts in. And guess what? The contestants and the people watching consistently thought the questioners were smarter.
It's wild how easily we can be tricked by these little things without even knowing it. Like, our brains are wired to see patterns and make judgments, even when those judgments are totally wrong.
It's true. And understanding this whole context thing is so important, not just for understanding people, but for figuring out how social change actually happens. Sometimes it's not about these grand gestures or big changes, but about those subtle shifts in our surroundings that nudge us in a new direction.
All right, you're definitely giving me a lot to think about here. But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, there's another cool concept Gladwell talks about that ties into this power of context thing, the rule of 150. What's that all about?
That one comes from the research of this anthropologist, Robin Dunbar, who studied how primates socialize, and he found that there seems to be a natural limit to the size of a group that can really stay close-knit.
And that magic number is a 150.
Exactly. It's kind of like how it's easy to remember everyone's name and birthday in a smaller group, right? Well, Dunbar's research suggests that 1 in 50 is that sweet spot for keeping that level of closeness and connection. Once you go beyond that, things start to feel a bit more impersonal.
So sometimes bigger isn't better when it comes to groups. It's kind of counterintuitive, especially with how connected we are these days.
It is. But Gladwell has some really interesting examples. Take Gore-Tex, the company that makes that breathable fabric. They purposely keep their factory small, usually with no more than 150 employees. This allows for closer relationships, better communication, and a stronger sense of working together towards a common goal.
So it's like they're creating these little communities within the larger company. It's fascinating how they're using this ancient rule of social connection to create a more innovative and collaborative work environment.
And then there's the Hutterites, this religious group that's lived in self-sufficient colonies for centuries. They have this really interesting tradition. Whenever a colony gets close to 150 people, they split it in two.
They literally divide the community. Why do they do that?
They believe that keeping groups smaller than 150 is key to keeping things harmonious and making sure everyone feels like they belong. In a way, they're intentionally avoiding the drama and division that can happen in larger groups. And this practice, which they've been doing for centuries, lines up perfectly with Dunbar's rule of 150.
It's mind-blowing how this rule seems to apply to such different situations, from these ancient religious groups to modern-day companies. It makes you wonder if there are other hidden rules shaping how we interact that we're totally unaware of.
That's the cool thing about Gladwell's work. He revealed these hidden patterns and makes us question what we think we know about how the world works.
Okay, so we've explored the law of the few, the stickiness factor, and the power of context. But how do these ideas actually play out in real life? What kind of case studies does Gladwell use to bring them to life?
One example is the success of that book, Divine Secrets of the Yaya Sisterhood. You might remember it. It was a massive bestseller, super popular with book clubs.
Oh yeah, I remember that one. Everyone was talking about it. But it wasn't just that it was a good book, was it? There was something else going on.
Exactly. The book itself was engaging and people connected with it emotionally, but its success was really amplified by the power of context. Book clubs were the perfect place for the book to spread. It created a social experience that made it stickier and fueled word-of-mouth marketing.
So it was like people weren't just reading the book, they were discussing it, arguing about it, and sharing it within this community. It turned into this phenomenon.
And that's the power of context in action. Gladwell also uses the example of teen smoking to show how these tipping point ideas can contribute to a social epidemic, even if it's a negative one.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Teen smoking is all about image, trying to fit in, being cool. It's like a social contagion spreading through peer pressure and those salesmen we talked about earlier.
Exactly. But Gladwell also points out that how much smoking sticks with people varies a lot. Not everyone who tries cigarettes ends up becoming a smoker.
Wait, really? So some people can just try it and not get hooked? That's surprising, considering how addictive nicotine is supposed to be.
It kind of challenges what we think we know about addiction, right?
Yeah.
Gladwell talks about these people called chippers, those smokers who only smoke every once in a while, who don't fit the idea that nicotine is always addictive.
So it's not just about willpower. There are other things involved. It makes you wonder if there's a way to figure out who's more likely to get addicted before they even start smoking.
Yeah, and that's a question researchers are really trying to figure out right now. If we could pinpoint those who are most susceptible to nicotine, we could tailor prevention strategies specifically for them.
That's a really interesting thought.
Yeah.
It's like we're not all equally susceptible to these social trends. Some of us are just more vulnerable than others.
Exactly. And getting a handle on those individual differences is key to figuring out how to intervene effectively, whether we're talking about smoking, obesity, or any other behavior that can spread through social groups.
This is making me think about how we can use these insights from the tipping point to actually create positive changes. It's not just about selling stuff or spreading gossip. It's about understanding the forces that shape our world and using that knowledge to make things better.
Absolutely. The tipping point is the call to action. It's challenging us to think differently about how we approach those big societal issues and recognize that we all have the power to be agents of change. And, when we're talking about social influence, Gladwell mentions Judith Harris and her book, The Nurture Assumption.
Okay.
It basically challenges this idea that our parents are like the main force shaping who we are.
Hold on. So all those parenting books I read might be totally off base. If it's not our parents, then who's really calling the shots?
Well, Harris argues that parents provide the love and support for sure, but it's actually our peer groups, the people we hang out with, and just the wider social scene that have a way stronger influence, especially when we're teenagers.
That makes sense if you think about it. Like how much time teenagers spend with their friends compared to their parents. It's like they're using their friend groups as this testing ground to figure out who they are and how they fit in.
Exactly. And this has huge implications for how we deal with things like teen smoking, If it's more about social dynamics than what your parents tell you, we need to get way more creative with our strategies.
It's like trying to change the whole culture instead of just focusing on individual behavior. It's kind of a mind-blowing concept.
Yeah.
But Gladwell doesn't just focus on the negative side of these social epidemics, though, does he? He also talks about how these same ideas can be used to, spread good stuff, right?
Yeah, totally. He talks about Rebecca Sadler, who created this program to raise awareness about breast cancer among African-American women in San Francisco. She knew that the usual health campaigns weren't really working.
So what did she do differently? How do you get people to really pay attention to a message, especially when it's about something like health? It can be tough.
Well, Sadler realized that hair salons were these amazing places where people would come together and share information. They were trusted places in the African-American community. So she was like, let's tap into that. She trained hairstylists to become these mavens of breast cancer information.
Oh, that's smart. It's not some boring lecture. It's a comfortable and familiar setting where people are already connecting and talking.
Exactly. Sadler gave the stylists the power to have real conversations with their clients, weaving in important information about breast cancer during their regular appointments.
It's such a powerful example of how understanding context and social dynamics can be the key to getting a message across. Okay, so we've seen how these tipping point ideas can work on a smaller scale, but what about those big ideas that sweep across entire societies? How do those take hold?
Gladwell tackles that by looking at 6 degrees of separation. That idea that we're all connected to everyone else through no more than 6 people. It's like that game where you connect actors to Kevin Bacon.
Oh yeah, 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. It's fun, but it shows how interconnected we all are, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. But Gladwell doesn't just stop there, right? He digs deeper into how some of those connections are stronger than others.
Right. He talks about Stanley Milgram's famous experiment from back in the 60s. You remember that one where people in Nebraska had to send a letter to a stockbroker in Boston, but they could only send it to someone they knew personally, on a first-name basis?
It's like a chain letter, but with a specific destination. It's amazing that those letters actually made it to the stockbroker.
Yeah, on average, it took just 5 or 6 steps. But what's even more interesting is that certain people kept showing up as, key links in those chains. The connectors.
So those super connected people are like the express lanes of the social world, making it a small world after all. But it's not just who you know. It's about how strong those connections are.
Right. Yeah. Gladwell brings up the idea of the strength of weak ties, a term coined by Mark Granovetter. It basically suggests that when it comes to finding out new stuff or opportunities, our weaker connections, like those acquaintances we don't know super well, can be more helpful than our close friends.
That's so counterintuitive. You'd think your close friends would be the ones to have your back and open doors for you.
Here's the thing. Our close friends usually hang out with the same people and have access to the same information as us. But those weaker ties, they connect us to totally different worlds, exposing us to new ideas and possibilities that we might never have encountered otherwise.
It's like they're bridges to uncharted territories, helping us expand our horizons and break out of our usual social bubbles. It's making me want to, take stock of my own network and see where those weaker connections could lead.
And Gladwell emphasizes how important context is in building these connections. He talks about Lois Weisberg, this woman who was so connected to Chicago, it's almost legendary.
She was like the ultimate connector. Was she just born with that gift or what?
Well, personality definitely plays a role, but Lois actively created opportunities to connect with people. She organized events, joined all sorts of clubs, volunteered for different causes. Basically, anything that introduced her to new people and new ways of thinking.
It's like she was intentionally weaving together this huge social tapestry, one connection at a time.
Exactly. And her story shows us that we can actually shape our own social lives, seeking out experiences that connect us to a broader world. So, speaking of connections, Gladwell gets into this case study about how these seemingly tiny changes can have a huge impact on a product's success.
Okay, I'm always up for a good business story. What company are we talking about?
Airwalk, the shoe company that exploded in the 90s, they went from being this niche brand for skateboarders to like a mainstream cultural phenomenon.
Oh yeah, I remember Airwalk. Their shoes were everywhere. What was their secret? Did they just have really cool designs?
It was more than just the looks. They really understood those tipping point things we've been talking about. Their marketing company, Lambesis, knew that to make it big, they had to bridge the gap between the innovators, those trend-setting skateboarders, and the early adopters, that bigger group that really drives mainstream success.
Okay, so how do you take that cool factor from this niche subculture and make it appeal to a wider audience? Do they just, like, plaster their logo all over MTV or something?
It was more strategic than that. Lambesis acted like cultural anthropologists,
Yeah.
really studying the trends and what those skateboarding innovators were doing. Then they took those trends and worked them into their advertising, creating this link between Airwalk and what was seen as cool and cutting edge.
So they weren't just selling shoes. They were selling a whole lifestyle, a feeling of being part of something cool and rebellious. It's like they were selling a little piece of that skateboarding subculture.
Exactly. By tapping into what was already happening in culture, they positioned Airwalk as this brand that represented authenticity and coolness, riding that social wave all the way to the top.
It's a good reminder that understanding how social trends spread is so important. It's not enough to just have a great product. You have to connect with your audience emotionally, tell a story that they want to be a part of. It's like you said before, it's about being a social strategist, not just a message maker.
Right. And Gladwell also brings back that fundamental attribution error we talked about earlier. It's so easy to misjudge people when we focus too much on their personality and not enough on the situation they're in.
Yeah, it's like we're always trying to find explanations, trying to figure out why people do what they do, but sometimes we jump to the wrong conclusions.
Gladwell reminds us to pay attention to the context, to consider what might be going on in someone's life before we decide what kind of person they are.
It's a call for empathy and understanding, right? It's about recognizing that we're all just navigating this crazy world, and sometimes our actions don't really show who we truly are.
That's such an important message, especially today when it's so easy to judge and label people based on just a little bit of information or a quick interaction. We need to remember to give each other the benefit of the doubt.
We touched on the rule of 150 earlier, this idea that there's a limit to how big groups can get before they start to lose that feeling of closeness.
And Gladwell really dives into that concept, showing how it plays out in all sorts of situations. He talks about Gore-Tex again and how they keep their factories small to encourage those close relationships and a sense of community.
It's like they understand that human connection is essential for innovation and collaboration. They're not just building factories, they're building communities where people feel connected and supported.
And remember the Hutterites, that religious group who split their colonies in half whenever they reach 150 people.
Sure.
It's a tradition rooted in their belief that smaller groups are crucial for social harmony and belonging.
It's fascinating how this age-old rule still holds true today, even for companies like Gore-Tex that are on the cutting edge of innovation. It really makes you wonder if there are other hidden rules shaping how we interact that we haven't even discovered yet.
Right. That's the beauty of the tipping point. It reveals these patterns and makes us rethink what we assume to be true about how the world works.
Okay, so we've got this rule of 150 influencing our social groups, but what about the digital age, We're constantly bombarded with information and messages online. How do we even process it all? It's overwhelming.
Gladwell tackles that head-on by exploring this concept of immunity. It's that resistance we build up to information overload. Think about your inbox, your social media feeds, all those ads and notifications popping up everywhere. It's a lot.
It's like our brains are putting up a shield to protect us from this constant onslaught of information. It makes you wonder how any message can actually get through.
And that's the big challenge for anyone trying to communicate these days. Gladwell suggests that we need to be much more strategic and selective in how we craft and deliver our messages.
So it's not about shouting louder or creating more content. We have to find a way to cut through the noise and make our message truly memorable.
Exactly. We need to focus on creating messages that really stick with people, messages that connect with them on an emotional level and stand out from all the clutter.
It's making me think about how I consume information, how I decide what to pay attention to and what to ignore. It's like a constant battle for our attention.
That's why understanding those tipping point principles is more important than ever. We need to harness the power of those connectors, mavens, and salesmen to amplify our message and break through that immunity barrier.
Gladwell talks about how companies are getting creative in finding those key influencers. He uses the example of Lexus and a pretty unexpected tactic they use to connect with their most loyal customers.
Oh, you're talking about the Lexus LS400 recall back in the early 90s. Recalls are usually a PR disaster, but Lexus actually turned it into a win.
Okay, I'm curious now. What did they do? Did they offer free car washes for life or something?
It was more personal than that. Instead of just mailing out recall notices, they called up every Lexus owner personally and offered to pick up their car, fix it, and bring it back sparkling clean, all for free.
Wow, that's going above and beyond for your customers.
It was a genius move. By doing that, Lexus figured out who their most passionate customers were, the mavens who would tell everyone about their amazing experience and spread the word about Lexus's incredible customer service.
So they turned a potential disaster into a brand-building moment. It shows how powerful it can be to flip a negative situation into a positive one and to recognize that every interaction is a chance to build a relationship.
And speaking of relationships, Gladwell shares this fascinating story about how IRAs, individual retirement accounts, went from being this little-known financial thing to a super popular savings tool back in the 70s.
IRAs are so common now. It's weird to think there was a time when people didn't know about them.
But back in the 70s, they were a brand new idea. Gladwell explains how this smart marketing guy realized that IRAs could be a huge hit with a specific group of people. Teachers.
Why teachers? What made them such a good target?
At the time, teachers weren't paid well and often didn't have access to the same financial perks as other professionals.
They're like an untapped market, a group of people with a real need that IRAs could address.
Exactly. This marketing guy saw that IRAs could give teachers a special opportunity to save for retirement and get some tax benefits. And by focusing on teachers, he tapped into a network of mavens who were excited to share this awesome financial tool with their colleagues and friends.
It's like he started this word-of-mouth marketing campaign fueled by a group of people who were passionate about spreading the word.
Right, and that grassroots effort was a big part of making IRAs so popular. It's another example of how understanding the dynamics of social trends and finding those key influencers can make a wind of difference in spreading an idea.
It's like finding the right seeds and planting them in fertile ground. If you nurture those connections and tap into those influential networks, your idea can grow into something amazing.
It's a great reminder that we're not just sitting on the sidelines. We can actively shape the world around us. We all have the potential to make a difference. And one of the most fascinating things is how quickly and unexpectedly these social epidemics can spread. It's like 1 minute something's brewing under the radar and then bam, it's everywhere.
It's like that thing where you hear a song for the first time and then suddenly it's like impossible to escape. You hear it on the radio, in the store, everywhere. You're like, wait, how did this happen?
Gladwell uses this virus analogy to explain it, which I think is really clever. Just like a virus needs the right conditions to spread, so do ideas and behaviors and products. And those tipping point factors we talked about, the law of the few, the stickiness factor, the power of context, they all come together to create that perfect environment for a social epidemic to take off.
So those connectors, mavens, and salesmen are like the super spreaders, carrying the message to everyone, and how sticky the message is, like how memorable and interesting it is. That's like the virus's ability to actually infect new people.
Exactly. And the context, that social environment where everything's happening, that's like the petri dish where the virus can either thrive or just die out. Gladwell uses this example of a syphilis outbreak in Baltimore back in the 90s to show how even small changes in context can totally change how an epidemic plays out.
Okay, syphilis is definitely not the most fun topic for a podcast, but I am curious, how does this syphilis outbreak connect to those tipping point ideas?
Well, so in the 90s, Baltimore had this sudden spike in syphilis cases. And at first, researchers thought it was because of the crack epidemic. They figured it was leading to riskier sexual behavior.
So they kind of jumped to conclusions, blaming it on one thing without looking at the bigger picture.
Yep. But as they dug deeper, they found that it was way more complicated than that. There were a bunch of factors that had accidentally created the perfect conditions for syphilis to spread. One thing was that they had closed down a bunch of STD clinics, so it was harder for people to get tested and treated.
It's like taking away those safety nets that help keep outbreaks under control.
Exactly. And then on top of that, they tore down a lot of public housing projects, which displaced a ton of people, a lot of whom were already at higher risk for syphilis. When they moved to new areas, they brought the disease with them without even realizing it.
So all these seemingly random events, the clinic closures, the housing demolitions, along with the crack epidemic, they all combine to create this like perfect storm for the disease to spread. It's like those individual threads, when they're woven together, make this much bigger and more complex tapestry.
That's a great way to put it. It really shows how these social problems are rarely simple. There's usually a whole web of things contributing to them. But Gladwell also talks about how these social epidemics can be sparked by things that seem totally insignificant, even just one person.
Right.
He calls it the power of translation, which is basically the ability to take an idea or message and adapt it for a new audience, making it relevant and interesting to them.
So it's like explaining some complex scientific theory in a way that anyone can understand, or taking a product that's successful in one country and changing it up so it works in another one.
Yeah, exactly. Gladwell uses the example of hush puppies, those shoes. They were huge in the 50s and 60s, but by the 90s they were seen as totally outdated and uncool. But then something pretty interesting happened.
Oh yeah, hush puppies. They made a comeback, didn't they? I remember seeing them everywhere in those fashion magazines. What happened?
It all started with this small group of teenagers in the East Village in New York City. They started wearing hush puppies, ironically, like they were taking this brand that was considered lame and turning it into a statement.
So it's like they completely flipped the script, turning what was once uncool into something cool and unique. I love that.
Exactly. And then some big fashion designers picked up on this trend and started using hush puppies in their shows. They became these translators, taking this underground thing and bringing it into the world of high fashion.
And from there, it trickled down to the rest of us, becoming a huge fashion trend. It's wild how a handful of teenagers in the East Village could bring back a whole brand like that.
It just goes to show the power of social influence and how even small, seemingly random trends can become mainstream if the conditions are right.
And it shows how important it is to be able to translate ideas and messages across different contexts. Whether you're selling something, advocating for a cause, or just trying to communicate effectively, understanding this power of translation is super valuable.
And, it's important to remember that these principles of social epidemics can have a dark side, too. The same things that help positive trends spread can also contribute to some really negative outcomes. Gladwell talks about suicide contagion, which is this tendency for suicides to cluster, often after a high-profile case.
Oh, wow. That's a really heavy thought. Are you saying that the media reporting on a suicide can actually lead to more suicides?
It's a tough topic to talk about, but research suggests that there is a link between media coverage and an increase in suicide rates, especially for people who are already vulnerable. This sociologist, David Phillips, studied this a lot and found that suicide rates would often spike after a suicide got a lot of media attention, and that copycat suicides would often use the same methods as the original one.
So it's not just the idea of suicide itself spreading, but the actual details of how it happened. That's a huge responsibility for the media to consider.
It definitely highlights the importance of being responsible with how things are reported and being aware of how what we say and do can affect others, especially those who might be struggling. This deep dive has been so interesting and really made me think the tipping point is such a powerful way to look at the world.
I agree. It encourages us to look beyond the surface, to find those hidden patterns and connections that are driving social change all around us.
Yeah, totally.
It made me realize that we're not just watching things happen. We can actually be tipping points ourselves, and start changes in our own ways.
That's so true. Whether it's supporting a cause we care about, spreading a positive message, or just being a good influence on the people around us, we all have the power to make a difference. And those little actions, those ripples we create, can have a much bigger impact than we might think. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the tipping point, everyone. We hope it's giving you some new insights and that you're feeling inspired to make your own mark on the world. Until next time, keep exploring.